If you don't understand asynchronous architecture, you may not be building as performant of applications as you should be. So let's talk about what it is and then do a hands-on demo with SvelteKit and a platform called Altogic. What's up, everyone? My name is James Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. And recently I was thinking back to my experience starting as a software developer and how I had no idea what an asynchronous architecture is, and thinking about the fact that if you don't understand an asynchronous architecture, you could be losing a lot in terms of performance and user experience for your clients or customers or just users on your sites. So I want to take the opportunity to explain what an asynchronous architecture is. So we'll talk about that for a few minutes. We'll talk about a few specific examples of when you might experience this. You've probably already experienced asynchronous architecture behind the scenes, even if you don't know what it is. And no, I don't just mean asynchronous JavaScript. So we'll talk about this in a second. And then I want to do a hands-on demo to kind of show you this stuff with code and no code by using SvelteKit on the front end with the SDK from Altogic that integrates with the Altogic backend, where we're going to do all of this messaging and endpoints and other things with Altogic and low code, no code tools. So we're going to do the theory of what asynchronous architecture is, and then we'll get hands-on and actually show a demo of how this stuff works and how to incorporate it into the applications that you build. Really quickly, this video is sponsored by Altogic, which allows you to build very powerful backend systems with no code whatsoever, which is really, really neat. You'll get to see that hands-on in the demo. So let's start off by talking about what an asynchronous architecture is. At the highest level, it's a decision between what things, what actions, what function calls, etc., need to be synchronous versus asynchronous. What does that mean? Well, synchronous means that you have to do one thing after the other. So if I want to do two things, step one and step two, I have to make sure that step one has completely finished before I do step two. So that's usually because step two is dependent upon something in step one. Now, what a lot of people miss is if you have step one, two, three, etc., some of those lower down steps are not necessarily dependent upon some of the previous steps, meaning we don't need to necessarily wait for those things to completely finish before we move on to the next step. That's where asynchronous architecture is making a decision for any number of steps that you have in any logic on the front end or the back end, etc., regardless of language, which one of those need to be synchronous versus which ones of them can be async, where we're not having to wait around for the previous ones to finish. So let's talk about a real world example for me working at a company in FedEx. FedEx is a huge company with lots of different teams that have lots of different projects and applications. Oftentimes, these applications are dependent upon communicating with each other in some way. Typically, what happens is one application will maybe scan a package, then it will send information over to another service for that service to do something with that information, whatever that is. Now, you may expect if one application sends information to another application and they need that application to do something with that data, that they may wait for that whole transaction to take place, meaning service one calls service two, it waits for service two to finish doing something, and then it returns back to service one. But the reality is service one in many cases doesn't actually care that the thing gets done at that time. It just cares that it's going to get done by service two, which means it doesn't need to wait for service two to finish. It just needs to know that service two has acknowledged the request, for example. So asynchronous architecture in this case says service one can just shoot a message over to service two, have it be acknowledged saying, hey, got your message, I'll take care of it, but not necessarily wait for all those actions to take place. That means service one now can be much more performant because it's not sitting there and constantly waiting for service two to do its job. It just trusts that service two is going to do its job when it has the capability. Let's talk about another example from a user interface perspective. Let's say you have a dashboard with a button that's going to kick off some very long process. It takes maybe a minute or two to start this process. So from the front end, you click the button, it's supposed to send a request to the back end, and the back end is supposed to do a thing that takes several minutes. And then the front end will reflect that that thing has been done. Well, we don't actually want to wait that whole time for the back end to do its job. What we can instead do is the same idea of front end calls the back end acknowledges the front end, hey, we'll get that done. The front end can go about doing its own thing, and then the back end with socket.io or something like that with a socket connection can send a message later on to say this thing has been done. This way, the front end is not waiting constantly for the back end to do its job. It's able to trigger the back end to do a thing and then receive a message asynchronously after that thing is done. Now, the third example I have is relevant to the specific tutorial that we're going to build hands-on with SvelteKit and Altogic. And this is the idea for something like a sign-up workflow. So when you sign up for a new platform, I don't know if you've really thought about this before, but behind the scenes, there's probably lots that goes on. So here's one of the things that maybe happens. You sign up for a new platform and it then sends you a verification email to your email. So you sign up, it adds the user to the database, and then it generates the email, and then it sends the email to you. You click the link and go through the verification process, etc. The interesting thing about this is that whole process doesn't need to be synchronous. The front end almost only exclusively cares that the user was actually created in the database so that they can then go and log in. They don't necessarily care if the email for verification has already been sent. That can happen within a few seconds or maybe a minute or two after the fact. So we can actually offload the email process to an asynchronous background piece of work, return back to the user so that the sign-up process for the user is quicker, and then we're able to process that email going out after the fact. Now, oftentimes the way asynchronous architecture works through communication is with something called message queues. And this is that idea again of I send a message somewhere, I know that that message is going to be there until the thing processes that message. So if I'm service 1, I may send a message to a queue, and then service 2 is constantly looking for work, looking for messages on that queue to go and do its job. And that's exactly what we're going to build in Altogic, which is the sponsor of this video. So in the backend, we're going to set up our endpoints. We're going to set up our data model. We're going to set up a queue to send a message to, and then we're going to have that queue trigger a service, or a service is going to get triggered from a message in the queue to go and actually send that email. So that's what we're going to build hands-on. Let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so the number one resource you'll want to have for this is the source code for the SvelteKit demo. And this is under a repository from Brad Garapi called JQQ Demo. So he's been helping build demos for me for videos, which has been a ton of fun. And Brad is amazing. You should also check him out on YouTube because he creates amazing content there. But inside of this repository, there is the Altogic email verification. Right now it's in a separate branch. This will be in the main branch when you go and watch the video. So you can have the source code to follow along. Now for starters, I have a SvelteKit application already generated. You can look at the SvelteKit documentation of how to create a brand new project, but it's configured with TypeScript, and then I added Tailwind CSS on top of this. So we have a very basic form for a setup. Now I've created a video on this recently about how routing works in SvelteKit with our page.svelte and page.server files, etc. So if you want a refresher on that, you can go back and watch that video. But in this case, under the signup directory, we have failure success verify, but then directly under it, we have the page.svelte, which is basically just our signup form. So here's our signup form, our email, let's go button, etc. Now what happens is we want to submit this form and handle it in an action inside of SvelteKit, and then we'll eventually send that data off to Altogic to be able to integrate with our backend. So speaking of which, let's go ahead and create a new app inside of Altogic. Again, this is an extremely powerful platform for building backend applications with no code. It really is pretty neat. So let's do JQQ email verification. And it'll give us a subdomain on here. That's fine. Don't really have to worry about that. And then I'll choose the data center of US East. And then we're going to do on the free plan. So you're going to choose the free plan just like I am here. So we're going to choose a blank app and we'll go ahead and create this. And then inside of this backend, we're going to need to create a data model to represent our users. And then we'll also need to create our services, our endpoints, and then our queue. So let's go into our database and we'll start by creating our users model. So let's go ahead and create a model. And this is going to be a users model with no group. This will be a permanent one. And then we can add timestamps for created at and updated at. That's fine. We won't worry about creating endpoints right here. We'll come back to that. So let's go ahead and create this model. And let's go ahead and add a few fields in here that we're going to care about. So in this case, we're going to want a text field for email. So we can give this type of email. Go ahead and create. Now we're also going to want a token. So this token will be as a text, and this is going to be the token that we generate for the user for them to then be able to verify. And then we'll have a Boolean in here. So we'll have Boolean, and this will be is or just verified. So a verified Boolean determining whether or not this user has in fact been verified. All right, so now we want to create two endpoints in our backend that is going to handle the incoming request from the user to sign up and to verify their email. these will actually send the process off to a service. So that's where the actual logic goes. But first we need to create these endpoints. So let's go to our endpoint here and let's create two endpoints. Again, one is going to be for auth verify. So this is going to be the verify one, and this is going to be a post request. So post request to /auth/verify. And then we will add a new no-code service called verify. We'll come back and actually add the logic for that. But an API endpoint accepts the endpoint and then kicks the logic over to the service. So we'll have the auth verify, and then we'll have one more endpoint for the sign up. So this will be auth-sign up. And this will be at the route of auth sign up. And then we will kick this off to another service, and this one will be called sign up. So we have our endpoints that handle the incoming request that forward the logic over to a service to actually handle the functionality. Now, one thing I missed is this should be a post instead of a get. All right, so we have our two endpoints. Now we want to actually create these services that handle the logic here. So let's go into services, into service here, and we have our sign up and verify that we just created. So let's go into the sign up service, and you'll notice we have basically this drag and drop editor. It takes a little bit to get used to and kind of understand where everything else is, but this is incredibly powerful to go through and do all of our logic. So the first thing we want to do is create the user in the database. So the user in the database is going to take the email from the incoming request. Then we're going to add a Boolean of false for the verified. We want to save that in the database. We want to then submit a message to the queue. Now this message in the queue is how we're then going to trigger the verification process for this user. Now, while we're actually generating this user record, the second thing we're going to do, in addition to marking this user as not verified, we're also going to generate a unique token that's going to be saved in that user model so that we can compare against. So I'm going to search over here for get object value. So I'm going to bring this over, drag and drop. And so you can get the input from your endpoint. So this will basically be the form data in that submission. And we want to bring that into the get object value. And we can say, what object do we want to get? We want to get from the input object, we want to get the body. So basically the body of this request. Now you can see that it's giving us an error here saying that it doesn't actually have a property called body. So what we need to do is go back up to the endpoint handler and make sure that we're passing along the body to this get object value. So this is going to be of a single model and it's going to be a user's model. So this is saying that the data coming to the endpoint is going to be a user. Then we're going to send that over to the get object value, where we're going to get the body of the request in the endpoint, if that makes sense. And from there, we want to augment that object. And to do this, we can do a set field of object in memory. So we basically want to take the output of the get object value, which in this case is the picked value. And now we want to augment that thing by adding key value pairs. So remember the two things we want to do. We want to add a property for verified. So we'll add verified in here and we'll have this be false. And we need to wrap, this is a key, so it needs to be in parentheses there. So we want to have the verified property set to false. And then we want to have a token property. Remember, these are all models on the database that we set. And then this is going to be set to an expression where we can generate a unique identifier. So if we click on this, we can get a little IntelliSense for our functions, and we want the UUID. So we want to call the UUID function to generate a new token. So we'll do UUID, call it, and then that will generate that key value pair. So that's going to represent the object that we need to save to the database. And now we want to take that thing and actually save it to the database. So we'll create a single object. So we'll drag this onto here. Again, this is going to come from the updated object into here. And now what type of model do we want to create? We want to create one for the user model, which makes sense. And then come through here and basically take the defaults. So this will create the record for the user in the database. But remember, we haven't actually kicked off any sort of email process. And now to do this, we've done the part that we need to do synchronously. The asynchronous part is we want to send off that email for the user to verify their email. Now for this to happen, we need to go and create a queue. So what we're going to do is we're going to send a message to a queue to say, hey, when a service reads from this queue, this message, they will then go and send that email. So let's go ahead and create, we'll come back to finish out this endpoint, but let's go to message queues and let's create a new one for our verification emails. So let's do a queue. Let's call this verification emails. And the routed service that we haven't created yet is we'll create a new service for handling this. And this will be the send verification email. Now, again, the benefit of this is we're able to, during this sign up flow, so let's go back to the service for sign up. During this flow, we want to create this individual object, and then we also want to send asynchronously a message to the queue, not wait for that thing to be processed, and then return back to the user. So let's go and search for submit message to a queue. Let's drag this on here as well. So we want to send a message to this queue, and we're going to drag the created record from here into the input for the message being sent to the queue. Which one are we going to send it to? We're going to send it to the verification emails queue. So now we need to determine what sort of input our send verification service is looking for. So let's go back to our services. Let's go into send verification email for the service. And inside of start, we want to define that we're going to be looking for a message body entry, and we'll call this a user. And this is going to be of a user's model, and it's going to be a singular user. So we define what sort of input this service should expect, which can now influence what we send to our queue. One more time, back to service. Let's go to sign up, and then we will send a message to the queue. And then we are going to reference what we're sending, what type of data we're sending to the queue. So inside of here, I'm going to change under common, I'm going to change the name of the input to be user so that that's a little more legible. You can see this updates here. And then under custom, you can see that that is the thing that we're actually sending. Now, another thing that's interesting is if we wanted some sort of delay in this process, we could add a message or add a time period to keep the message in the queue before it's processed. But in this case, we don't need that. So after this whole thing is done, we are going to return a success response. So we can take this from the trigger to the message queue, and we can also grab the created user and send that back in the response as well. So we have this entire flow, and we're able to kick off this asynchronous processing by submitting a message to the queue to then have it be processed by our service. So let's go back into services, and inside of the send verification email, this is the logic that's going to run when that message is processed off of the queue. So inside of here, we have our start. We know it's expecting information about a user, so we have that in there. And then next, we're going to call a create email message function. Now, it's really cool that this sort of stuff is all built into Altogic. It makes this really, really nice. So the from email in here, we're just kind of making this up because we're not using our own SMTP servers, but we'll call this verification at example.com. The from name is going to be Altogic email verification. Again, you can add your own SMTP server if you want this to come from your actual own domain. And then who are we sending this to? We're sending this to input.email. So this input object is a user object, which then has an email field. And I'll send this to myself for now as a copy. All right, no need to BCC, no need to do a reply. And then we can have the subject say, please verify your email. Now, the next thing we want to do is add a link to a route inside of our SvelteKit application that includes the actual token that we just generated for that user. So we can say, visit the following link to verify your email address. And then inside of here, we want to have http://localhost 5173. Again, just while we're in testing, then you could update this to be the real thing. We'll have this be sign up. And then we'll have a verify endpoint, and then we'll have a query parameter called token. And then inside of here, we're going to pass in the value of the token for that user. So this is input.token. Thank you. So again, we're sending this email. This email has a link to go back to the application, which includes the token and the URL. The application will then need to parse that token and then handle the rest. So let's see what sort of validation we are failing here. We need a closing quote there. So we're going to create that message. Then there's a second step for sending the email message. So we'll go ahead and call this. So the email message that we just created, We're going to pass it into the send email message, and we're going to use the default SMTP server, and then we will finish successfully. Now, notice they also have errors, so if something goes wrong, you can handle errors as well. We're going to finish that successfully. So what we should be able to do now is add logic inside of SvelteKit to handle when someone tries to sign up, sending that data to Altogic. So we're going to need to incorporate the Altogic SDK, which we'll come back to in a second. But let's go ahead and add the logic inside of our signup to be able to start to get the data from the form and then send that off. So this is going to go inside of the signup folder, and we're going to create a new folder or a new file called page.server.ts. So this is a TypeScript file. This is something .server means it only is run on the server, and we're going to now handle the form submission. So we do this by creating an actions. So we can say const actions, and this is going to be of type actions, which comes from SvelteKit.js or from, SvelteKit.js. And then this is going to be an object. And inside of here, we're going to have the default action. And this is going to be an async function that takes in a request event object. So that request event, and then we want to respond to that in some way. So inside of here, I want to get a reference to the form data. So what was actually submitted in that form, and we can get this from our event.request.form data. So this will get us the actual form data. And now we need to send the email to the Altogic endpoint. All right. After we do this, then we can, it's kind of interesting, we can throw a redirect. And so we want to do a redirect with a 302, and we want to send them to the signup/verify. This is just redirecting them to a page that's going to say, hey, check your email, because we're going to send you an email and you'll need to verify your email that way. All right. This actually, I think, goes inside of here. And then we need to import the redirect. So this comes from SvelteKit, SvelteJS kit as well at the top. And the last thing we do in here is we export the actions. All right, I think we imported actions from the wrong place. This will come actually from the types in here. So there we go. All right, so now we need to integrate the Altogic SDK into our application so that we can send the request from SvelteKit, handling that response, handling that form submission, sending it over to Altogic, and letting Altogic take care of the rest. So Altogic has an npm package, so that's what we're going to install. So if we look inside of here, we should have basic instructions. So we'll install Altogic. We'll run this command. I like to create a utils directory. So I'll create a utils directory and then call this altogic.ts. And then I've already got an example of this that we can use. So I'm going to copy this in. And we're going to need to get two URLs. One is for the Altogic environment URL, and one is for the client key. Now to do this, we can create a .env file. So we'll do .env. And then we need to give key value pairs or give values to these keys in here. So these are the two properties we need. This is pretty common if you've used other platforms where you need the environment URL, which project basically are we working with, and then the client key to incorporate that here. All right, so let's go back to Altogic and let's go into our settings. Let's go to authentication. Let's do client library keys. And we have our master client key, so we can use this. Make sure that you keep this private. Don't include this in any public code, so don't check in your environment variable. But I'm going to put this into the client key, and then now we need to get the environment URL as well. And we can actually find both the client key and the base URL on the home. So if we come to the home tab, we can get this here as well. So I'm going to copy this top one, and then we'll throw this into here as the environment URL. And now we can come back to the page.server functionality and start to use our Altogic instance to be able to work with it. So let's import Altogic. So that should have done a named import from the utils directory. And then we can use Altogic to call an endpoint. And in this case, we need to tell it which endpoint we're calling, which is just the path to that endpoint. And if you remember, we gave it a path of auth sign up. And then what are we going to pass in here? We are going to pass form data. So we'll have the email property be the email that we get from the form data. So this will be from email. All right. And then we want to await that. And actually, this is endpoint.post. So endpoint.post and no dot there. So we want to call an Altogic endpoint by sending in a post request and include the email inside of it. So let's check this out. Let's go ahead and run this. All right, so that looks good. And then let's come into our application. So our sign up application, I'm going to sign up with my email. And this should redirect us to a page that says, please verify your email. You can give as much detail as you want. And then I'll open up my email account and see what the link is that we got. All right, so I have my email. It's taking me to this link. So it's got the code inside of here. We'll go to verify. We haven't actually added any logic in here to handle this. So we'll do this in a second. But it did generate that. And then also if we look inside of users, we should be able to see our content. And this is actually in the Navigator. So inside of Navigator, we can see the content that was created. And we should see it created this token 8485E blah, blah, blah. That should be the same as what's up here. So that's actually working. Now we can go through and handle on the SvelteKit side, needing to do this verification. And this is also going to happen inside of a page.server file, page.server.ts. And so inside of here, before we load this page, we want to see if there is a token in the browser or in the URL. Then we want to do the verification part. If not, we just let it go ahead to the page. So we're going to create a page server load function. And I think we need to import this. So page server load. So we get this from our types. And this is going to be an async function. We'll destructure the URL because that's the thing we want to look at. And we want to grab the token from the URL. So we'll do url.search params.get and then give it the key of token. And maybe that will work better. All right. So that should get our token. And we say, if there's not a token, go ahead and just return. So go ahead and progress to the page because that's the page that they get redirected to after sign up to then see that they need to verify their email. Now, if there is a token, then we continue and we want to destructure the data that comes back from calling Altogic. So we'll import our Altogic client that we created. We'll import that. We'll call endpoint. We'll call a post. And we're going to post to /auth/verify. And then we'll pass in that token. If we get back no data, that means it didn't go so well. So we'll throw a redirect to, we'll give it a status code of 302, and we'll pass it to sign up and failure. And if not, we will throw a redirect in a good way to, with a 302, and we'll do this to sign up/success. All right. And then lastly, we want to export this load function. All right. So let's talk through this logic one more time before we do the last piece in Altogic. We sign up, we click enter, we click to sign up on the front end. It calls the action in SvelteKit, which handles that, and then it submits it to the endpoint in Altogic. Altogic endpoint calls a service, it creates the user in the database, it generates a token for the user, and then it adds a message to the queue that's processed asynchronously. When that message is processed, it sends the email to the user, it sends them to the verify page, and now we're trying to call the endpoint in Altogic here to actually verify that. So we haven't done this yet, so let's go back and go into our endpoint. We have our verify endpoint, and this is where we need to actually handle the logic for the verification. So let's go into here. And basically what we want to do is we want to query the database for a record where that token matches a token in the database. So we can say inside of here, we want to get an input of type of user. Great. And then we want to get a single object by query. So we want to query the database for a single object based on the token match. So inside of here, the query is going to be, we want to query this based on input object.body.token equals this dot token. And what's the thing that we're getting submitted? We're getting submitted a user, which then means we can check this, which is the user thing that we got submitted. We can check this dot token, and we can compare that against the, this is for the database side, and then we compare that against the token that we actually got in the incoming request. All right, now if we do get that, we want to call a set field of object in memory. We want to update that record. So that found record, we want to update now with a key value pair of verified, because this means it happened successfully, verified, and have this be set to true. So we want to update that thing if we got it. If not, we will just return a response. So we'll return response. And this will basically return no data, which will signify to the front end that that process didn't work. So we updated that object. Now we want to actually update that record in the database. So we'll update single object by ID. And this is going to come from this updated object. So inside of here, we want to get a reference to that verified user that we just got access to. So we could update the output of this to be output here. We can update this to verified user. Then we can update this input to say this input is going to be a verified user. So we get this verified user, and now we want to actually update that thing in the database. So what's the query going to be, or what's the ID that we're looking for? We're looking for the verified user dot underscore ID. And then the model that we're looking at is the users table. So we want to take that updated record, we want to grab its ID and then update that record in the database. All right, so from here, we want to return a success response. So we'll bring the success response out, and we'll say the thing that's triggering this is that thing being updated. And then we also want to add the data to that response as well. Because remember, on the front end, or in SvelteKit, we're checking to see if we get data to determine whether or not that thing is verified. So let's go through this entire process one more time. Let's delete this record. So let's go inside of here, and this is inside of the navigator, which is another piece of this to inspect the database. So we have all that stuff right there. Let's go through the sign up page, and let me add my email. Say, let's go. We should see inside of here, if we refresh, we should see the record created. The token starts with C7 something. Going back to my email, I have a newer email. So let's check that. So here's this. It will redirect me. And ideally what will happen is this will send me to the application. It will behind the scenes do the verification and then redirect me to the success page. So if we click on this, it sent me back to /signup/signup/success. Which is not the way this is supposed to work. It should have been just /signup/success. So let's go back. Let's actually click. It probably already did the verification, so it happened, and then it sent it to the right place. And then inside of here, you can see we have the check for verified. Now you'd also want to clean up things like go ahead and get rid of that token. You'd also want to set expiration dates on it and things like that. So the cool thing is, although we use this to kind of teach a concept, Altogic actually has this workflow already built in. So if you just use the sign up that they offer you through the SDK, it has all this stuff built in with verification tokens and caching to make it even more performant. But that is asynchronous architecture. Basically, the general idea is if it doesn't need to be synchronous, you can offload it to be synchronous, so you're not having to wait on it, but making sure that your application stays consistent and also maybe a little bit performant. So let me know what you thought about the video in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed it, and check out the next video.